Dear students, today's session is about art in the GDR and art of the opposition. We've talked about what was going on in the West, about the extremely interesting experiments with abstract art, with performance, exploring physical limits, exploring the limits of painting, exploring the limits of the material, exploring audience participation. All these very, very exciting things that were going on in a very, very small part of the Western art world, which are now considered to be the decisive development of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Western art. Of course, there was a lot of conservative stuff going on at the same time. I mean, you know, we had people like Gina Pana and Chris Burden doing these extreme performances. Of course, at the same time, there were people who were still painting landscapes, just as there are today. And there's nothing to say against that. We probably all will keep needing landscape paintings for a long time to come. So, and what was happening behind the Iron Curtain at that time? We already mentioned some of that last time. You may remember it. We mentioned the interesting fact that a lot of the experiments that became so important in Western art in the 60s and starting with the 50s, performance, abstract art, they all go back to the beginning of the century or before that, and a lot of that, a lot of abstract art, a lot of conceptual art, a lot of even also of performance, of modern filmmaking, of modern photography, had a focal point and had its origin in Russia after the revolution. So we're talking 1918. A lot of what became important and characteristic and liberating in art during the 20th century goes back to that time in Russia, which then became a socialist country and, yeah, as you know, the leading power of the Eastern Bloc, which was kind of against the political idea, because the original idea of socialism was, as defined by Marx, that it would be, you know, that at some point capitalism would exhaust itself because of its destructive tendencies, and it would kind of, world society would kind of spontaneously turn to socialism as a more sustainable, human and just system. That was the idea. And all societies and all countries would be equal, and there probably wouldn't be any need for nation states anymore. So all this originally, the original idea of socialism contradicts the idea of a leading state, which is actually a problem that happened in the 20s. In the 20s, the Comintern took over, the Communist International, under Russian leadership, which was kind of a, you know, it was a disguise for Russian dominance over other socialist countries. So that was one of the snags there. However, this is just an aside. The idea, when the socialist countries came about, most of them after the Second World War, the founding idea was we wanted just society with less privilege that provides for everyone, which still today seems like a very good idea. And it did work out for a lot of people, but it didn't work out over time for several reasons. In art, interestingly, as we said in art, so many of these extremely exciting new directions of the art of the 20th century had most of their roots, some of their roots, in revolutionary Russia. But then what happened? As we already said last time, once parliament, once the Duma was closed, once the revolution was more or less over, once Stalin and Lenin took over, once Russia was not a revolutionary society anymore, but they established a new, stable society that, however, was not open, that was not democratic, that was trying to provide for everyone, to everyone according to their needs. But it could not allow for the open discussion anymore and for the liberties which are the point of democracy and which allow development and which also allow experiments in the arts. So what we come up with then, many years later, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the GDR and the socialist brother countries, in terms of art, is in many ways quite conservative, which is a surprise, right? This idea, okay, we have these countries who were trying to build a new, more open society, and then they come up with this really, really bourgeois art that has to be realistic. It's even called socialist realism, that is strongly focused on painting and traditional figurative sculpture, that is focused on narrative, on telling stories, on being accessible to the masses, and that needs to be aligned to, mostly, to the political aims of the government. Of course, there was wriggle space. Of course, there was a lot of space for a lot of artistic experiment, nevertheless. However, in terms of media, and also often in terms of subject matter, what happened there was kind of conservative. For example, if you went to art school in the German Democratic Republic, you needed to be able to do a bronze sculpture or a large-scale painting if you wanted to take your final exam and get a degree. Doing a performance, like someone tried in Dresden, I don't know who it was, someone tried in Dresden, he got a motorbike and drove up the stairs in the art school and said that was the piece. Okay, for that kind of piece you couldn't get a degree in the East. In the West, depending where. So, the question is, why weren't they more experimental? Because they were in similar situations. Yes, people lived in different systems. A lot of people lived in capitalist systems and other people lived in socialist systems. However, the world situation, especially here in Germany, was kind of similar for us. A lot of people, if all you wanted was to have a good job and raise your family, and if you didn't want big luxuries or far travel, or think outside the box, then you could have a really good life in both parts of Germany, provided you got the good education, which was probably easier in East Germany than in West Germany. It was easier if you had no privilege. So, what are we talking about then? The situation was in many ways similar. After the German states came together and I went to university in Berlin, I met all these people my own age from East Germany. It was so interesting because, of course, we had lived in completely different systems and there were so many differences, but some basic things were the same. For example, when we were kids in school during the Cold War, when the sirens went off and gave the alarm signal, none of us ever thought that this was a mistake or a test or something. We all thought the same. We all thought this is it. Now we will have a nuclear war and we will be right in the middle of it. Same fear, yeah? Same fear, East and West. Or when we had an earthquake, we never thought it was an earthquake. Of course we thought it was a nuclear bomb. And on the surface, you could have a very, kind of normal life. Another thing is, of course there were limits to what was possible. But there were also limits in the West. For example, the most famous example about the limits of life in the East are, yeah, but people couldn't travel. It is true, if you wanted, if as a citizen of the German Democratic Republic, you wanted to leave the country, you wanted to travel in other countries, especially in the West, you needed invitations and permits, and you needed political clearance. For example, my drawing teacher here at Berlin University, she told me that when she was 40, she was allowed to travel to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to meet a colleague there. And her political supervisor told her she was allowed to go now at 40 because she was considered politically mature enough. And also she had a child, so they assumed that she would be coming back. Yeah. Okay. On the other hand, you did not have this kind of limitation in the West. Theoretically, we could go everywhere we wanted. We just had to come up with the money. And that was not as easy for everybody. You know, I know that this will sound simplistic, but it may serve as a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb being that your freedom in the socialist countries was circumscribed by politics and privilege. Because, of course, still today, if you come from a, look, for example, in Vietnam, Vietnam, still a socialist country. For example, a few years ago, you couldn't access Facebook. But if you came from a privileged family, from people with good positions within the political hierarchy, of course you had it all. Yeah, sounds despicable, right? But the same goes for the West. Yeah, of course, theoretically you were allowed to go everywhere, but you had to come up with the money. And of course, if you had someone who had a good position in the financial hierarchy of the capitalist state, then it was much easier, and then of course you could. See, so as I said, rule of thumb, in socialist countries, your freedoms were defined by politics and privilege, and in the capitalist countries, they are defined by money and privilege. Talking about the German Democratic Republic, for me as somebody coming from West Germany, is quite difficult. Why? Because the German Democratic Republic was, on so many levels, a very, very contradictory construction. You must realize the German Democratic Republic was founded, or it generated from that part of Germany that had been occupied by the Red Army after the end or during the end of the Second World War. And it was made into a socialist state, not by a revolution, but on order of the occupying forces. It was made into a socialist state by military power. And at the same time, however, it was founded, I mean, the Russians didn't do this, or people from the Soviet Union, forgive me, they didn't do that on their own. I mean, there were a lot of people, Germans, who wanted this too, and who worked for this, and who fought for this. And there had been people who died for this before the war and during the war. This idea of a society where everybody would give what they had to give and receive what they needed. Imagine that. I mean, it's such a wonderful idea. And the German Democratic Republic was founded on military orders, but it was also founded by the Germans who had fought in the resistance, by the Germans who had come back from the concentration camps, by the Germans who had resisted fascism, by the men and women who still remembered who still remembered the 20s, who still remembered the open social experiments and the progressive ideas of the 20s that were then plowed under by fascism, which included socialism, which included emancipation for women, which included a right to abortion, which included so many things that people in the West didn't even have access to. It included a rich cultural life that was paid for by the state and that was for free for everybody who wanted to go there. It included public transport that practically cost nothing because it needed to be affordable for everyone. It included an unimaginable financial safety for everyone. It included work for everyone. And even, of course, it was not financially sound, but it was socially sound. Everybody had a job, more, like 99.69%, except for people who maybe weren't psychically, emotionally up to it, who were sick, yeah? Everybody had a job, and if it was only sorting nails, but you had a job, you were a member of society, and you got wages, and you could live on those wages. Of course, the Western German says, yeah, but there was nothing you could buy for those wages. You couldn't buy a car. You had to wait for a car for 10 years, less if you had privilege. It was difficult to get a TV, and so on. Also, depending on which decade we're talking about, the GDR existed for 40 years, so depending on when you talk about it. However, for example, the rents were low. The cost of living was low. Education was for free. Childcare was provided and for free. And there was stuff like that, for example, West German women could only dream of. For example, in the 70s West Germany. My mother, who at that time was a university teacher and held a doctorate, she had she had to ask my father for a written permission that he allowed her to work, to hold a job. Women in West Germany couldn't hold their own bank account without a permission from their husbands until 1975. Both my grandmothers would have liked to go to work, but my grandfathers didn't allow it. My fatherly grandfather, just because he was a conservative, and my motherly grandfather, who's not a conservative, he said to my grandmother, who was a trained accountant, he said, you cannot go to work because I'm a financial consultant, and if my wife needs to make wages, then they will think that I'm a gambler. And legally, he had the power to make her stay at home. She couldn't take a job without his permission. He could say no. Another thing that women couldn't say no to was sex inside marriage in West Germany. Legally, not. So once you got married, your husband was officially, by law, allowed to rape you. You were not allowed to tell him no. That doesn't mean that in West Germany in the 70s, all the husbands habitually raped their wives. Of course not. But imagine the difference. Imagine what it means if a man by law has the right not to accept, to ignore you when you say no. What does it mean in terms of entitlement? What does it mean if you want to get a divorce because your husband raped you? You had no handhold there. He was within his rights. He was allowed to rape you. You couldn't get a divorce because he did that. And also, also for the good men, a good guy, he could think he was a great guy just because he accepted your no. Instead of just not being an asshole, or instead of just not being an abuser. So, this is the kind of thing we're dealing with. And however, and I think that is very, very important, the German Democratic Republic was not a democracy. They had elections, and they had several parties, 3 or 4, However, all the elections ended with more or less the same results. They had always 97.6 or 98.9% for the one socialist ruling party. And, however enthusiastic people may be, this is kind of a giveaway. Where if one party gets that kind of result in an election, so not a democracy. Which of course had repercussions for the art world too. Because, of course, in the GDR there was censorship. Do you know what a white elephant is? No, you won't. However, it's a good technique to know. A white elephant was a kind of decoy to circumvent censorship. If you were an artist in the GDR, you had a good life. Being an artist in the GDR meant you had an income, you were financially secure, you probably had a kind of status in society. Artists were important. You had to be a member in one or several art associations, because otherwise you couldn't show. You had to be organized in a socialist association, because only they had access to galleries and museums and places where art could take place. And before a show could take place, somebody would check whether what was going to be on display was in line with the politics of the day. Not just in general. What was allowed or not allowed changed a lot over time, especially after Stalinism was over. In the 50s, you could go to prison for the most ridiculous things, as we would see it today, and that became a lot, that eased up a lot. However, it was very clear that there were artistic statements that were desirable and others that were not desirable and that wouldn't be given the platform. So what did you do as an artist? If you had pieces you wanted to show, but that you were kind of in doubt whether they would pass muster, if the censor would allow them, what you did was put in one very, very obviously undesirable piece, something that could not be shown because it was too abstract, or because it was religious, or because in any other way it was too westernized, or somehow it was not desirable in a socialist context. One very obvious piece, then the censor would seize it, would be content with having done his or her work, and the rest of the show would probably go through. And, even outside socialist structures, this is, it's just a very, very good strategy. Keep it in mind. It may come in handy in very, very different contexts. So, what am I saying? I am saying that in the German Democratic Republic, there was no free art scene. Everything was organized. Everything was controlled by the state. Why? Because in a democracy, your government can ideally rely on a majority of society. There is supposed to be an acceptance for government and the political line of the government, which means that a democracy can afford discussion and dissensus. A democracy can afford contradicting opinions. A democracy can afford argument. It can afford to argue about standpoints, about solutions. An authoritarian state cannot, not for political reasons, because if you do not have a majority behind your rule, you need to be very, very careful who gets to say what in public. You need to control the public. You cannot allow open discussion. And I also think it may have to do with the mentality of people who build and rule authoritarian states. This idea of this deep conviction that they are right and the others are wrong and therefore shouldn't be heard and shouldn't get to talk. Which takes us right back to hegemony, right? To hegemonial culture. This problem of who gets to talk, who gets a platform, who becomes visible and who doesn't. And privilege and hegemony actually are valid throughout different structures, throughout different systems. Privilege operated in socialist society just as much as in capitalism. So, control the public. Control the public means that until the 80s, until the fourth decade of the German Democratic Republic, every kind of publication was under control. Book publications, newspaper publications, museums, galleries, all kinds of places where art could be shown or performed, theaters, concert halls. Everything was state-run, and everything was under constant scrutiny. So, official art in the German Democratic Republic, let's have a look at it. Very often, what you hear from people who don't know so much about it is, oh yeah, there was socialist realism, which always shows healthy workers and is probably not so far from Nazi propaganda, and they all had to do the same in the arts anyway. This is not true. Some of it is true, that of course the subject matter that a society that wants to strengthen or that wants it to be a society that is run by workers and farmers has different subject matters than a capitalist society that inherits the traditions of centuries of privilege, of centuries of old undemocratic and hierarchies and of money. Of course, there are different subject matters, have to be. Also, the German Democratic Republic was very clear. Artists in the German Democratic Republic, once you managed to be an artist, of course you had to go through art school and earn a degree and be accepted into the artist organization. But once you had made that, you had a very good standing because you were considered an important part of socialist society, contributing to morale, you know. And of course, the idea was that your art had to be politically important and valuable. However, the ideas about what was politically important and valuable were quite flexible, changed a lot over time, and yes, as I said, there was space to negotiate, to experiment. And even within these limits, it's very interesting what people did. Because, I mean, artists are still artists. There were people who were functionaries. But of course, there were also people who were intellectually and artistically curious, who wanted to find out things, who wanted to move things, who wanted to contribute to a good society, but who also were just, you know, interested in the world, in love with the world. They wanted to find out things by their art, and they wanted to inspire others. So, I've brought you a painting by Harald Metzges from 1959, oil on canvas. It's called Polytechnical Lesson. And which is, so 1959, this is 14 years after the war was over. 1959, you know, people had rationing until 52. The kids you see here, how old are they? 12 maybe, born just after the war. The teacher, this is a person who probably saw the war. And what are they doing? Okay, polytechnical lesson. This must be something at school. And what are they doing? Okay, they're working with tools. the teacher is measuring something, the instructor, wearing the blue overall of a worker. However, he's instructing a class. We have children, interestingly, boys and girls. The girl in the red pinafore, she's in the front, occupies a central position here, and they're working on a machine. Maybe, I think they are sharpening their tools. Looks like a sharpening device. And they may be in a wood shop, I'm not sure. Yeah? Or actually, he's measuring a piece, so they may be working on metal, actually. So, what is happening here? This looks like, okay, this is just a lesson. This is somebody instructing kids in a workshop, in a metal workshop. Why is that interesting? Or is that interesting at all? Yeah, that is interesting in many ways. A, school is not a subject we find a lot in art or instruction. That's not something, for the last 200, 300 years we have, since modern art, we have a lot of nightclubs, people going out, people at leisure time enjoying themselves. We have innumerable landscapes. We have even more naked women, and even more naked women, and a few naked men thrown in. And yeah, I don't know. Instruction plays a very small role in modern painting. So that is interesting. It is an unusual subject. What else is unusual about it? Yeah, the subject itself, the polytechnical lesson. The polytechnical lesson was part of the new education system in the German Democratic Republic. The polytechnical lesson was the idea that everybody who goes to school should learn about work and production already in school. Kids should be prepared for work in production, for work in agriculture already in school, and even if they wouldn't end up there, they should know about it. Which, it's interesting because so many political problems, right now we've seen it this year, so many problems come from people, also people in government, not even knowing about the working conditions in hospitals or in production. Yeah? It is so interesting how little most of us, if we don't work there, know about the conditions under which the stuff we use every day is made. And the idea in the German Democratic Republic was that must change. People, kids, should learn about how stuff is made, things they use. Which of course implies a lot. It implies, okay, if they will go there to work later, they will already know stuff. But it also means if they don't go to work, they will have respect for this, they will have respect for material, they will have respect for the goods they use. There is a kind of sustainability before the word in here. So that was new. And that is what is in here. This is a painting not just about instruction. This is a painting about a new kind of instruction that is kind of new in the German Democratic Republic and characteristic for it and right at the core of its political program. Now look at all these people. How is the atmosphere? What do you think? Who are they? What are they like? They are not strong, big, positive, muscle athletes, are they? They are all they seem kind of melancholy. They're all very inwards. But maybe they are just concentrated. They're all very serious. Maybe they are aware of what they're doing is important. Or maybe they're just very much into it. And this is interesting. This is something that makes a big difference to German art from just 15 years earlier. I didn't bring an example. If you come to Berlin, go and visit the Olympic fields where the Olympic Games of 1936 took place. You will see a lot of statues from the 30s, like fascist statues, which are incredibly muscular bodybuilders wearing steel helmets, some of them. You have these abundant women who look as if they're going to pop babies all over the place in just, like gestation period 2 months or so. And they're all very, outgoing and positive and strong and, oh my God. Yeah. In comparison, if you look at these, they're all they're very slim, very concentrated. They're not taking up much space. They're not, they're not making a lot of noise. Look at the dark-faced teacher. The face obviously influenced by Picasso, by the Mediterranean portraits of Picasso. Not the kind of face you would have seen in Nazi paintings. Not the kind of atmosphere you would have had there. So this is also a stance against the spirit of the times from 10, 15 years ago. And 10, 15 years ago may seem a long time when you're 20, but it's not when you're 35 or 40. Another picture here by Fritz Skade. Mummy Comes Home from 1964. Mummy Comes Home. Also a very unusual subject. You see again, this is not boisterous. This is not loud propaganda. This is very interesting. You have these abstract experiments in the background. Interesting, right? This is not a country that was favoring abstract art. However, you see the forms are so simplified here. This is not what we normally call realistic either. It's not about the humidity in the dog's eye. Not at all. It is there are abstract tendencies in here. It's very simplified. These simple forms. Interesting, complex space. And look at it. Okay, you have a small kid. How old is this kid? 3, maybe? Just walking, 3, 4 years old. And mom is coming down. She's giving the kid a big cup of something. Her coat, the coat she has obviously just taken off, is over the back of the chair. Look at her. She's smartly dressed. She's elegant. She has an elegant haircut. Look at the blouse. Look at the abstract patterns of the blouse. Look at the pencil skirt, at the nylons. This lady hasn't come back from shopping. She has come back from work. And as I told you in the beginning, she obviously also was shopping. However, that's not how you dress for going shopping. Yeah, she comes back from work. And this is from 1964. Also extremely unusual. I mean, if we were to search art history for paintings of mothers coming home from work to their children, we will have a lot of difficulties of finding many examples. Yeah, we will find mothers, endless mothers, but they will not be working women. We will find a number of working women starting with the 19th century, starting with pretty farmers' wenches working in the fields by Courbet, and then real working women in the 1890s, and the barmaids of the Impressionists, and then working women in the 20s. However, we will find very, very few depictions of working mothers. And of course, working mothers always have been the reality, even 500 years ago. I mean, also mothers working for wages, workers' mothers. This idea of mom does not work is a bourgeois idea of the 19th century. This idea mother doesn't have a job, being mother is the job. This was never true for the majority of the population, because the majority, for the most time until the 20th century, simply couldn't afford it. Women would go to the factories and then come home and take care of the kids. And of course, also the wording is already wrong, like, as if women who run a household didn't work. I mean, they work from morning to evening, they just don't get paid. That's the difference, right? So, a working mother who probably gets wages for her work, coming home to her child, extremely unusual. And here the same, I mean, look at this. Very, very interesting. The atmosphere. Everything is so quiet. You know, it's quiet. The chair is between them, they're kind of separate, and at the same time, they are so connected. There is so much attention in the way she pushes the cup towards the child, and the child is so focused on the cup and so unexcited, and there's again this very quiet, concentrated atmosphere, as if everybody who saw the Second World War had enough of all that noise for the next 20, 30 years. And at the same time, you look, the atmosphere is very, if you look at the details, the stuff strewn around, it's very interesting. As I said, the abstract painting or window or whatever it is in the back, extremely interesting, extremely avant-gardistic, not quite legal in the GDR, actually. Abstract art was supposed to be a bourgeois decadent Western, and still Skade found it interesting and smuggled it in here and created a special light and avant-gardistic atmosphere which mixes with the everyday life of the milk bottle, of the vegetables, of the toys, and of mother and child. And of course, this was very modern. And of course, this is a 20th century thing. And as I said, even though this was normality for the majority of people for the last few hundred years, it is a new thing to acknowledge this a reality in the 20th century. And it's early in the 60s. You know, in just a few kilometers away in West Germany, you do not find this kind of painting. And of course, we had working mothers in the 60s. But as I said, until 1975, a married woman had to get her husband's permission to even hold her own bank account and also to go to work, to hold a job. Another interesting painting, which is more in line with maybe the common idea of what socialist propaganda looks like. This is by Willie Zitter, who was a high functionary in the official artists organization in the GDR until the very end. A chemical worker at the controls, 1968. And you can see that all these painters are technically brilliant, and they are interested in the experiments that are going on in painting at the same time. I mean, look at this. Yes, it is realistic. Yes, it is figurative. However, look at the brushwork. This free brushwork, look at the hand, yeah? How the whites and blacks are right next to the skin tones, how in some ways the body seems to be dissolving, also the face, yeah? In a kind of impressionist way. But however, the overall impression is more like cubism a bit, how the image is splintered into different perspectives. And at the same time, yes, you have a worker at the controls, and okay, how much more propagandistic can you get? This was the idea, workers at the controls, male workers, of course, again. Yeah, I'm not saying that the GDR was a feminist state, not at all. However, free childcare, the need for women to do jobs in a country that was underpopulated, and rights like a right to abortion and to family planning, and once you had a family, you would get a flat, you know, it was a lot of people, you know, young families were provided apartments by the state. It was easier to get an apartment if you had a child. Yeah, that had its effects at the time. Still, yeah. And another one by Metzges much later. Remember the Polytechnical lesson from 1959? This is 26 years later. The GDR by now is not a young state anymore. Actually, it is already nearing its end, which nobody knew at the time. Here, Harald Metzger, The Comedy, Oil on Canvas. And again, you see, this is very different from the Polytechnical Listen. This is pretends to be a theater piece, probably about Venetian theater. If you look at the left-hand side, you see this striped pole, which is typical for Venice, and it's kind of pole for attaching your gondola to. And you have these people in costume, also from the traditional Commedia dell'arte, Italian costumes, very agitated, moving very much. No faces, all are masked or faceless, like the woman in white on the right-hand side, no face. And you see in the background, behind these comedians who don't look very comic, who seem to be performing or fighting or quarreling, or it's not quite sure, somehow enmeshed in a kind of melee. And in the back are, at all different angles, is the scenery, parts of theater scenery, which seem to be falling all over the place, about to come down. And by now, it is very hard to look at this painting that was made just 4 years before the end of the GDR and not to interpret it as, or not to read it as an interpretation of a state that is about to come down, of a state that has become a kind of mise en scène, that is itself a kind of theater piece with people in the background standing on ladders trying to uphold the scenery, the the Potemkin villages, you know, the fake the fake stage background, while in the front everybody is upset, not themselves, out of their minds, going in every which direction. And the whole thing obviously is going to come down. There is no performance going to happen here. Or if there happened one, it's over now. And you know, there are so many different interpretations of why the GDR ceased to exist as a state. And Glasnost and Perestroika obviously led to this. But when you look at it into detail, you know, when you look at the speeches held in public during the days before the wall came down, and I remember watching it on the television from West Germany, you get this impression that this state came down because the leading elite, the leading old man and occasional old woman, had completely lost touch with what the population wanted, with what a younger generation needed, with what a generation needed for whom it was not enough anymore to just be anti-fascist and to be provided for. They needed more, and the government didn't understand it, and they had lost connection, and they wanted a democracy. So they had not been rejuvenated by elections. And that may be one of the biggest reasons why this construct ceased to exist at that point in time. These were 3 examples of what was officially accepted art in the German Democratic Republic in different decades. And you see, it's by no means uninteresting. It's also not super conservative, however, it is conservative in terms of the medium, in terms of it being figurative painting. And we talked about the need of an authoritarian state that doesn't have democratic elections, the need to control public discussion, because a public discussion could destabilize the regime.
Of course, it is next to impossible to keep human beings from discussing stuff. All you can do is limit it. And to limit it, you normally, historically speaking, you normally need to use extreme force. This is what happened in the 50s under Stalinism. I talked to a professor, to a colleague who was a professor for a long time at the art school in Dresden, Dieter Honig, great guy. And he told me, look, he had a student in the 50s who painted a person sitting on the official party newspaper, and he went to jail for such a poor joke. Who went to jail in the 50s. This became a lot easier later on. However, there was a lot of stuff that was not officially allowed and not officially shown. You have seen how artists still manage to smuggle in stuff that they found interesting. Even at the big mosaic at Haus des Lehrers, you find the influence of Picasso, of Cubism. However, it was always very important that stuff stay figurative and also non-religious normally. Things became much more relaxed after Stalin was dead, after the 50s. However, as I said, controlled, limited discussion. There was stuff that could not be shown in public, that could officially not be produced, and that, of course, people still discussed. Which is why, by the 80s, when the atmosphere was incredibly more relaxed in comparison to the 50s, why in the 80s in the German Democratic Republic we had a huge, huge unofficial scene, and some of it existed already during the 70s. For example, Dresden now is famous for its abstract scene. It's scene of abstract art in the GDR, which was officially not allowed. However, there's even a name for it. It's called the Dresden Informel. So there were all these experiments that could not, or in most instances, could not be shown in public, but they were still happening. Because, of course, there were these people who are curious, who were intellectually curious, who were artistically curious. And even though access to outside news was limited and inside news was controlled, it's very hard to keep stuff secret. Very, very hard. Especially when there is a Western neighbor state with the same language, and you can receive television from over there. Also, of course, there was exchange. It's not like North and South Korea. There was exchange back and forth across the border. When I was a kid, we always had visitors from East Germany because, so like in the 70s and 80s, we always had visitors who came because they were my parents' colleagues. They were all specialized in German literature at the university, so we always had these people over. And of course, there would be exchange, discussion of stuff that was not necessarily accessible to everyone in the GDR. So they knew about experiments going on in the West. Their new colleagues were experimenting with new media, and they wanted to do this too, and they wanted to do it in their own way. And Dieter Honig told me how already in the 70s, they would meet in the basement of the Dresden Art School in a secret performance class and try out stuff, just with nothing more than the knowledge that there was the idea that of a new art form that was focused on the body. And they would just meet there and try out stuff and experiment. They couldn't show it. They couldn't talk about it so much. They had to be careful who they told about it. But they did it, and they wanted to find their own approach. Same with abstract art. And and a whole scene developed from that in the 80s in the GDR, which was also very much linked to the free music scene, to GDR punk music. And I've brought you a few examples to look at. This is an example of a performance and a musical piece by an artist group that was active in the 80s and who called themselves the Autoperforationsartisten, like the self-perforation artists.
That was Rainer Görs, Micha Brendel, Via Lewandowski. And this is the Panem et Circenses Aktion from 1988, right before the end of the GDR. They did this at the art school in Dresden. Look, by that point, they even did it at the school. And even though we have only this black and white photograph, you get this impression of, whoa, what is going on here? Compare that to the paintings we look at, how dynamic this is, how anarchic somehow. When people wearing these strange costumes, doing here girls in a ballet skirt, in a tutu on the ground, everybody in a way going crazy. Imagine the sound of this. You can see the musical instruments in the background. I've brought you another one. Same thing, another photograph from the same performance. And here you see one of the performers dressed up as a medieval fool, stuffing stuff into his mouth. And they became actually, over time, they became quite brutal, and they were at least as expressive and as urgent as Western performances in the 70s. They became quite extreme. This is Micha Brendel, Der Mutterseelen Alleinring, which is practically impossible to translate, from 1989 in the summer, like three months before the wall came down, no, five actually, exactly on the day, 5 days, in the Galerie Weißer Elefant in Berlin. It's actually called, the gallery is called White Elephant. That was an oppositional gallery. That was something that didn't exist until the 80s. A space where this kind of experiments was allowed, but of course also secretly observed and under surveillance. Because this is also what happened. By the 80s, we have a whole scene of abstract art, of oppositional art, of performances, and also, as I said, of punk music. A lot of which was taking place in inofficial venues like flats. They had their own magazines, like fanzines, which were handmade. Everybody who contributed would type his or her text 10 times, and someone else would contribute 10 copies of a print or 10 copies of a photograph, and then that was stapled together in a handmade magazine that was then distributed in a very, 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 today they are very valuable. They are editions, yeah. But at the time it was just, okay, we are able to make 10 or 15 copies of this, and then it can circulate. And we can keep our discussion going. And of course, the Secret Service knew about all of this. And of course, a lot of people were reporting on this all the time. But by then, the government seems to have accepted that it was better to allow a certain art scene to operate under close surveillance, so that the energy could kind of dissipate. You know, they had decided that it caused too much work, and it created too much negative news and too much negative atmosphere to suppress all this, and it was easier to allow it a certain space, but not too much. So, and as I said, a lot of what became popular in Western art in terms of alternative structures in the 90s actually came from the Eastern Bloc, like shows in private flats, like handmade magazines, like performance in the backyard with the whole pop-up concept was more or less invented there. And what was devastating after '89 was when after the GDR was over, or after 90 really, officially, and the archives of the Secret Service were opened, and it became public how many people had informed on this alternative scene, and how many of these had been cherished colleagues or spouses or good friends, and who still had worked with the Secret Service with whatever motives, under pressure or not. At some point, you could get the impression that this whole alternative scene had been staged by the Secret Service and the government. Because at some point in the 90s, you got the impression that a third of the GDR had been spying on the other 2/3, more or less. This is, however, not quite right. This is also something that is very hard to grasp for people from the West, and which is something very important that friends from the East told me. They said, yeah, look, if they asked you to report, you had to report. But it was up to you to decide what you told them. You can write, as everybody who knows who has already had to write a report, you can write a report that can damage others, or you can report about basically nothing. That is still up to you. Now, those were decisions people had to make then, and I do not envy them. Still, however, the alternative scene was known to the government, it was allowed by the government, and it was heavily infiltrated. Still, they had extremely interesting artistic experiments going on. I actually wrote my PhD about the autoperforation artists, or part of it. Here's another example by Micha Brendel. It's the Homunculus Monologue, which is, of course, quoting, very German, quoting Faust, but at the same time, it's very drastic. He is covered in animal blood. He's handling this animal corpse. It's probably a rabbit, and he is masked. He cannot see. He is gagged. He cannot talk, and he is handling this bloody body, and it all, of course, coming from a Western viewpoint, reminds us of what was going on in the West. And this is actually also this was very much the reaction of Western critics when they saw this in the early 90s. There were a lot of people who said, yeah, it's interesting, but we kind of had that 20 years ago, so it's not exciting anymore. Actually, I remember an article that said, this is only Granddad's old felt hat, which was referencing Joseph Beuys, of course, and implying that the GDR more or less would have developed, or was developing in the same way that the western part of Germany had, and that just slower. You got that a lot at the time. The idea was, oh yeah, it's all very similar, it's just like 20 years ago. And it may have seemed so in the outer appearance of things, like in car design and looking at the houses, and because the kind of turbo capitalism that had happened and changed the face of Western cities in the 80s and 90s hadn't happened in the GDR. Still, it completely denies the fact that the GDR was a completely different state, with a very, very different origin, with different aims, with a different system, and of course, with different problems and motivations. So, if these performances in their urgency and physicality remind us of the beginning of performance art in the West in the 70s, yes, okay. They may use different, or they may use similar methods. However, what is this all about? Where does this urgency come from? What was happening here? And when I talked to Micha Brendel in the course of my PhD project, he said, we were always trying to give one more turn to the screw. They were testing out the limits of what could be done in the GDR, of what could be expressed, of when the big stop would come down. And they never knew when they would overstep and when they would, stay just inside of what was possible and permissible, even in their alternative settings. And of course, this is about a feeling of oppression that needs to be acted out physically. This is about a feeling of not being free to speak, not being free to think, not being free to act. This is about a feeling of tightness, of being limited, of being narrowed down to something that is not enough. And in many ways, this may actually be expressing what in the end, what a lot of people felt but could not express, and what brought down this state at some point in the end of 1989, when people had lost so much faith in the system that they were willing to believe when it was said on the television that the wall was open. And they went there because it had been said on the television. We still don't know who handed in that note. And at some point, the soldiers who were guarding the wall, they just caved in. There were like hundreds of people coming. They were believing that the wall was open and that they would be able to walk over into the West and look at that fabled country that hadn't been accessible to them. And they were just coming, and they were standing there at the gates. And you can actually watch it on YouTube. You had these soldiers there that you can watch them talking on the phone to their superiors, and the superiors don't know what to do either because they have no orders. And you can see how these men had to decide whether they would shoot now or whether they would open the gates. And they opened the gate. So we have to assume that these extreme performances by the autoperforation artists express in their sadomasochistic drasticity, they express a pressure that was felt by a lot of people in the GDR. Not all. Not at all. A lot were also, of course, by the revolution and the complete deep elemental change that hit them all. A lot of them were plowed under and unhappy enough. But still, the pressure, this feeling of there is not enough space, there is not enough. This feeling of there is not enough space, there is maybe not enough air, may have been much more common than people in the government realized and people outside realized. I've brought you a few more objects to look at, also from colleagues associated in that same group. This is by Else Gabriel, the coat, high quality overgarments in the service of art. This is a fur coat with a Dow blood crust, brown rabbit. She used it in a performance. And you see here again this combination of fur and Dow and blood. It creates a very, very strong reaction, probably of disgust. And this is also about a visceral reaction. This is not about intellectually, civilly discussing things. This is about provoking physical reactions from an audience, because my theory also about Western art, like by Gina Pane or by Chris Burden, because performance art very often is about stuff that cannot be expressed in words and that needs to be expressed in physical action and in physical reaction in the viewers. Another object by Else Gabriel is this wonderful brush object, this tortured bread roll, which, it would be interesting to make in a more extensive comparison between the pierced bread roll and the pierced body of Chris Burden on the Volkswagen. That would be very interesting. And last but not least, this very, very this very, very interesting object installation, mini installation, camera installation by Micha Brendel, David and Goliath from 1986, as early as 1986, with 2 cameras and a tripod. It was stuff that was hard to come by in the GDR. And this, again, for closing, this, of course, is a piece of art and surveillance. This is all, you have 2 mechanical devices for the production of images, looking at each other, observing each other. And of course, the camera was one of the main instruments used by the Secret Service in the surveillance of the art scene and of everybody else, of course. And it was also originally an artist's instrument. And you have them confronting each other here, one small, one big. And they are inextricably linked and moving on the same tripod, which is a very, very interesting take on the complex relationship between the alternative art scene in the German Democratic Republic and other socialist countries, and the huge machinery of surveillance that kept them in check, but that also was like a huge public that was always constantly watching, that was always feeding them attention, that made every small gesture important. And when that ceased to be, I think that was part of the crisis of many, many artist colleagues after the wall came down, that suddenly so much of what they did was completely unimportant, and nobody was watching anymore because the surveillance by the Secret Service was over. Yes, so much on official and unofficial art, which of course were, linked and overlapping in the German Democratic Republic. I must repeat, I'm a Westerner, born and raised in the West. I did study the GDR, I did not live there. I talked to many, many colleagues from the GDR. But however, even talking to people who were born and raised in the GDR, who worked there as artists, official or unofficial or both, it is very, very difficult to get just one perspective on these very, very complex situations. And, there is a lot of stuff, which I just told you, that is kind of simplified, that is put in a way that is so that you can get an impression of what may have been going on there. But of course, many, many people would contradict me, and rightly so. This is what I can give you, is just a rough overview, a rough impression of this situation of constant negotiation that was going on in a socialist country between the official political line on art, between censorship and the human impulse to keep experimenting, to try out new stuff, and also to express inattention, which is, of course, linked to the surveillance and to a state in which the public discussion is limited.